Hello everyone, welcome back to Sigil. My name is Kevbot, and in today's video, I will be reviewing the two new releases from Wizards of the Coast, Forgotten Realms, Heroes of Faerun, and Adventures in Faerun. I will be reviewing both of these new source books, detailing what is included in them, things I liked, things I didn't like, and how I would have approached writing these books differently. With that said, we've got a lot to cover today, so let's get right on into it. Heroes of Faerun and Adventures in Faerun are the new campaign guides released by Wizards of the Coast for the Forgotten Realms, with heroes being written for players and adventures being written for dungeon masters. Starting with Heroes of Faerun, Chapter 1 includes new character options, expanded lore on the background of different species, new subclasses for all of the core classes except the Barbarian, Druid, Monk, and Warlock, new backgrounds, and new feats. Chapter 2 includes a general overview of Faerun, going over how time and currency work, before expanding on the different regions. Chapter 3 includes a general overview of religion in Faerun, and roughly half a page of lore about each of the main deities in the Forgotten Realms pantheon. Chapter 4 is a short section of expanded adventuring gear, as well as region-specific clothing. Chapter 5 introduces the new mechanic of circle casting, and some new spells. Finally, Chapter 6 has a fairly detailed overview of the main different factions. This is also the book that has the removable fold-out map at the back of it. Secondly, for Adventures in Faerun, Chapter 1 gives a brief overview of the realms, with Chapters 2 through 6 providing detailed descriptions for the regions of the Dale Lands, Icewind Dale, Calimshan, Moonshae Isles, and Baldur's Gate. Chapter 7 provides a sample adventure, The Lost Library of Lathanchos. Finally, the book ends with new magic items in Chapter 8 and a bestiary in Chapter 9. To start off with the things I liked about the books, I think the art in the books is fantastic. I feel as though the art in D&D books is always such an underrated aspect of them, and the art is especially important for campaign and setting books. Each setting should have a unique feel and tone to it, whether it be Eberron, Ravenloft, Dark Sun, or Forgotten Realms, and the art goes a long way to setting the feeling and tone better than can be achieved through writing. In that sense, I feel the art in both of these books does a great job at setting the tone and feeling for a typical adventure set in the Forgotten Realms. I also really like the included sample framework adventures that are found in the Adventures in Faerun. In the first chapter, there are 32 example adventure frameworks spanning levels 1 to 13, each taking up a page, and are categorized around being either a deity adventure, faction adventure, high magic adventure, or region adventure. I feel like these frameworks do a great job at introducing some of the basic guidelines for what is required for session preparation, namely a hook, a couple of fantastic locations with different monsters and treasures, usually with an accompanying map, and a conclusion. Being only one page long, these frameworks give enough information for a dungeon master to run, while also being written in a way that is expandable and not as overwhelming and daunting for a new dungeon master to approach. Whereas reading an entire hardcover adventure may make new dungeon masters hesitant to feel confident in running an adventure, these single-page frameworks would feel a lot more manageable. These frameworks would be great to use as anything from inspiration to drop into a home campaign, a one-shot, or even string multiple of them together into a longer campaign. While the adventure frameworks in Chapter 1 are written to be generalized and fall within one of the previously mentioned 4 categories, there are also specific frameworks for Chapters 2 through 6 to be used with the locations of the Dale Lands, Icewind Dale, Calimshan, Moonshae Isles, and Baldur's Gate. All of Chapter 7 is a longer single adventure called The Lost Library of Lathanchos. While it seems to be fine as an adventure on its own, I think it's mainly valuable as a teaching tool for new dungeon masters. Comparing it to the single-page frameworks, it could help to demonstrate how to add and expand to these adventures. There's also a section where it shows how to adapt the adventure to specific locations of the Dale Lands, Icewind Dale, Calimshan, Moonshae Isles, and Baldur's Gate by altering key details like locations and monsters. This is another valuable skill for new dungeon masters, and it's nice to see it here as an example and as a teaching tool. The last thing that I wanted to mention that I love, before getting to some critiques for the books, is the included fold-out poster map of Faerun. I have 4 maps of Faerun that have been printed since 5e came out, and this one is by far my favorite of all of them. Of the 4 maps that I owned previously, they all represented various scales, a close-up map of the Sword Coast, a broader map of the Savage Frontier, a map of the Greater Northwest, and a 4th map that expands out a little bit further than that. The one issue that I've always had with the larger maps that cover a greater landmass is that they're less detailed in their locations, losing some of the smaller locations and only listing the larger sites. However, the map included with these books is a combination of the best features of the previous maps. Not only does it cover the largest landmass by far, It is also the most detailed in its included locations. It includes a ton of locations specific to 5e adventures and covers so much of the continent. As I've said before, this is definitely my favorite map of Faerun, published during 5e, and in my opinion, second in quality only to the maps of Sigil and the Outlands from the Planescape box set. However, with that said, I do have a couple of critiques. Firstly, the back of the map isn't a map at all, but the calendar system for Faerun. I really don't like this being included on the back of the map, because there's no benefit to having the calendar on this larger printout in comparison to how it's written on the pages of the books. And it feels to me like a waste of space and almost an afterthought, like they didn't want to leave the back blank, but didn't know what to include. I would have liked to see another map of the same quality. Speaking of seeing another map, my second critique is that the map is only included with the Heroes of Faerun, and there's no map for Adventures of Faerun. So if you want to get the map, you need to purchase that one. It would have been nice to see both books come with a map, ideally two different maps, but I think it would have been okay if it was the same map in both books, as that would still be better than nothing included with the Adventures book. I also don't like how they made the decision to include the map with the Heroes book, as I feel that if you're only going to include the map with one of the two books, it would make more sense to include it with the book that was written for Dungeon Masters. So with that, I will transition now into my critiques for the books. One minor critique is the organization of the Heroes of Faerun. I feel like they should have kept the lore-focused stuff together, and then kept the player-focused stuff together. If I were organizing it, I would start with a guide to the realms, gods of Faerun, and then factions of the realms, to keep all of the lore material first and in the front half of the book. Then, I would have the character-focused material in the second half of the book, starting with the character options, magic of Faerun, and finally, Aurora's whole realm catalog. Speaking of the character options, my other critique is the heavy focus on new subclasses, feats, and spells. I don't think that any of them are bad, but I find their inclusion to be completely unnecessary. Firstly, the 2024 Player's Handbook just came out a year ago, and in that time, they've only released one published adventure, the Dragon Delves Adventure Anthology. Players have barely had a year yet to play the classes and subclasses in the 2024 Player's Handbook, let alone all of these new options, and very little published material to even play with so far. I feel like this is incredibly early on in the life of 2024 5e to already have these new subclasses, and there are better uses for his campaign sourcebook than including new subclasses, especially when the campaign sourcebook is for the Forgotten Realms. I say this because I'm okay when a setting book comes out with subclasses, feats, or spells that are specific to that setting, like what we saw with Eberron and Planescape. My issue here is that the Forgotten Realms is the default setting for 5e. I know technically they made it Greyhawk for 2024, but the two are so close in style and tone that they're essentially interchangeable in regard to this. So, in short, Forgotten Realms is not a campaign setting in need of its own specific subclasses, feats, or spells. I have an idea for what character options I would like to see in a sourcebook like this, but I will save that for the next part in this video. Speaking of unnecessary inclusions, my main critique for the adventures in Faerun is the inclusion and heavy focus on Icewind Dale and Baldur's Gate. The Dalelands, Kalimshan, and Moonshade Isles are fine, as there hasn't been much release for them during 5e, but there's honestly no reason to focus on Icewind Dale and Baldur's Gate with this book. Starting with Icewind Dale, we basically already got a campaign sourcebook for Icewind Dale with Rime of the Frostmaiden. Now, Rime of the Frostmaiden is technically an adventure book, but it works way better as a source and setting book than as a published adventure. Chapter 1 has tons of information for all of the 10 towns, and a mini adventure for each of them, and chapters 2 through 4 has tons of information and different mini adventures for the areas outside of the 10 towns for the greater area of Icewind Dale. My main critique for Rime of the Frostmaiden is that there isn't really an adventure written into it, with the first chapter being several different unrelated side quests, and then the actual adventure occurring between chapters 5 and 7. Now, getting back to Adventures in Faerun, it essentially follows the same structure for Icewind Dale, giving some lore and adventure ideas for each of the 10 towns, and then a bit of an overarching plot idea involving a new monster called the Zlon. So it just feels so redundant to have Rime of the Frostmaiden, and now basically the same inclusion here, and it would have been so much better to give a different region the same treatment. It's also interesting to see how they reference Rime of the Frostmaiden with a lot of the lore in this book. During Rime of the Frostmaiden, it's implied that the Shardolin found during the adventure is the same thing as Crinchinnabon, but they never outright say it. In this book, they confirm that Shardlin was created from the fallout of Crunchinabon at the end of the Crystal Shard, and there's even a reference to the Shardlin dragon in this section. As mentioned, the other unnecessary inclusion is Baldur's Gate, and for the same reason. We already had information about Baldur's Gate released in Baldur's Gate Descent into Avernus. This adventure is similar to Rime of the Frost Maiden, where the first chapter also really doesn't have anything to do with the adventure at large, and is essentially a mini adventure and source book for the city of Baldur's Gate, and the real adventure starting in chapter 2. Along with chapter 1, there's also a 50-page Baldur's Gate Gazetteer with more setting information for the city, dedicating 100 pages, or half of the book, to running adventures in Baldur's Gate. Again, similar to Icewind Dale, none of the Baldur's Gate content in Adventures in Faerun is bad, but just an unnecessary inclusion. I think if they could pick one city to focus on for this book, it should have been Neverwinter, as Baldur's Gate, Waterdeep, and Candlekeep have already gotten releases for them in 5e, but Neverwinter hasn't really had much release for it. I think my main issue for the reason why they included Baldur's Gate, beyond it being derivative, is what was likely their motivation to include it. The video game Baldur's Gate 3. I'm sure they saw the popularity of the game and felt the need to include it here to capitalize on the popularity, but this is a reflection of the day late, dollar short ethos of Wizards of the Coast. We know that the inclusion of Baldur's Gate into the adventure Descent into Avernus was done at the last minute to try and capitalize on Baldur's Gate 3, but the adventure was released in 2019, 4 years before the full game would be released, essentially ruining the adventure with its inclusion for nothing. And now, they're releasing this campaign book, but it's 2 years after the game was released. Both releases missed the popularity window, and both inclusions feel forced and derivative as a result. Speaking of head-scratching inclusions and inconsistent reasoning within Wizards of the Coast, my next critique involves the expanded bestiary with Adventures in Faerun. Controversially, when the 2025 Monster Manual for 5e was released, it did not include orcs or drow. This sparked a lot of discussion in the community, and the general reasoning from Wizards of the Coast at the time appeared to be the idea that including humanoid species like orc and drow as evil monsters, especially when they are player options, was problematic. Instead, we are given generic stat blocks, like the Tough or the Guard, that the Dungeon Master could then use to flavor as either an orc or a drow, depending on the context. Now, regardless of how you may feel about this decision, it was made and that was the logic behind it. So please explain to me why, literally 8 months later, there are drow included as monsters in Adventures in Faerun. I have my own thoughts on this whole issue that I won't get into here, but in short, I wasn't mad about them not being included in the Monster Manual, but I'm also not mad with their inclusion here. What I am mad about is the lack of internal and consistent logic within Wizards of the Coast. These are the red flags that I see sometimes that make me question their ability to be good stewards of the game. Either they didn't realize that there was an inconsistency here, or they didn't care. Neither of which is a good look. Now, my final critique is also related to not trusting Wizards of the Coast and their stewardship of Dungeons and Dragons, and that is related to something actually not published in the books themselves. There are 3 D&D Beyond exclusive releases related to these books: a vampire-themed player expansion, Astarion's Book of Hungers, a Dungeon Master-focused lore book for the Netherrealm Empire called Netherrealm's Fall, and a Magic the Gathering expansion for Lorwyn called Lorwyn First Light. I would love to read these, but especially Netherrealm's Fall, as I'm a huge fan of the lore related to the Netherese Empire, and I'm currently running a homebrew campaign that includes lost Netherese artifacts, so I bet there's a ton of cool information in here that would be helpful for the campaign. But I can't read these because I don't have a D&D Beyond account. I could create a D&D Beyond account to license the expansions and read it, but this leads into my fear of Wizards of the Coast not being good stewards of the game. I will always champion the release of physical books that I can buy and own and keep on my shelf forever. And I have no problem with Wizards of the Coast releasing material to license on D&D Beyond, as long as they still release the physical edition as well. With these expansions, not only do they not have a physical option, they also don't have a PDF version to purchase. In lieu of a physical copy, I would happily buy a PDF version that I could keep on my computer in a 3-2-1 backup system, but I will never license a product on D&D Beyond because outside of the fact that I don't actually own it, there's no guarantee that D&D Beyond will be around forever and I will be able to access it in the future. This is also no mere fear mongering, as Wizards of the Coast has a track record of doing this. They remove content all the time, things we used to have access to that are now gone forever. They used to host two different character builders and encyclopedias for 4th edition, both of which are now gone. They used to host the Dragon Plus magazine online, and now that's gone along with all of those digital magazines. The entire archive of articles, forums, podcasts, and resources that used to be on dnd.wizards.com is gone. Even on D&D Beyond itself, the platform in question, in 2022, they removed significant pieces of lore from Volo's Guide to Monsters for all customers of the book on D&D Beyond, with any option to keep it, even if you paid for it, non-existent. Want an even more recent example? October 24th, 2025, they announced they are killing Sigil, the online platform that they were developing for. So if you were waiting for the promised Gold Dragon digital miniature that you would get for pre-ordering the 2024 core rulebooks on D&D Beyond, looks like you won't be receiving that. The good news is that you will receive a digital dice set for D&D Beyond as a replacement reward, assuming they don't kill that as well. So my point behind all of this is that it's concerning that Asterian's Book of Hungers, Netherrealm's Fall, and Lorwyn First Light are released as D&D Beyond only digital exclusives, without even an option to purchase in PDF, as there's no guarantee that we will even be able to access these in the future. And this is the trend that I hope we don't see continue going forward with Wizards of the Coast. For every release, I want to be able to grab it off my shelf and be able to read it, whether it's my physical shelf or digital shelf, and not just now, but any time in the future. As mentioned earlier, I would like to end this review with how I would have approached these source books differently. When I first saw that they were releasing the book in two parts, one for players and one for dungeon masters, I got really excited by this because previous campaign source books had been primarily released just for dungeon masters. I got this idea in my head for how I would approach these books based on a problem that I face as a dungeon master. When running homebrew campaigns, I always run them in pre existing worlds because I personally hate world building, so it does all of that work for me. I also love learning about lore from different worlds, whether it be related to Dungeons and Dragons or otherwise. The problem I always run into with this approach is that I always end up knowing more about the world than my players do. Usually, I'll tell my players that the campaign is set in whatever setting. Right now, it's the Forgotten Realms. And because they don't know anything about the setting, the most that I'll get is them looking at a map, choosing a place at random, and deciding that's where their character is from. This is generally fine, but it does lead to some awkwardness at the table. Here's an example of the kind of situation that this approach creates, where let's say the party is looking at a map, trying to decide where they want to go next. One of the players sees the city Waterdeep, realizes that their character is from Waterdeep, and says, "Oh, my character's from Waterdeep. Let's go there." So I say, "Okay, the party arrives at Waterdeep. What would you like to do?" The player responds, "Oh, what does my character know about Waterdeep?" And I say, "Well, you would know that the main tavern is a place called the Yawning Portal." So the player says, "All right, let's go to the Yawning Portal." And I say, "All right, you arrive at the Yawning Portal. Do I recognize anyone in the tavern?" And maybe roll a perception check. You don't recognize any of the patrons, but your character would for sure know who the barkeep is, Durnan, and you see him standing behind the counter. Okay, we go over and we talk to Durnan. Cue an awkward NPC interaction. So the issue here is that I know more about the setting than the player does. And the choice of the character being from Waterdeep is completely meaningless. This results in the choice of going to Waterdeep, going to the Yawning Portal, and then eventually talking to Durnan, also meaningless choices on behalf of the player as well. I may as well just be telling them what to do with their character and playing their characters for them. I just tell them, you go to Waterdeep, you go to the Yawning Portal, and you want to talk to Durnan. That's not really fun for either myself as a dungeon master or for the players at the table. Now, one solution for this problem would be the player knowing more about the lore of the world, but that's a pretty tall ask, especially when lots of important lore is hidden behind dungeon master facing texts like campaign adventures. Also, sometimes I'll change lore, and I have lots of casual players who like to play, but they're not really into learning about all the lore themselves. However, my idea for how to approach these books could be a solution to this problem, and it involves the books working together in tandem. Firstly, I would get rid of all of the new subclasses, all of the new feats, and all of the spells as indicated before, and just have the books be filled with hundreds, if not thousands, of character backgrounds, ideally in chart form. And instead of giving a really deep dive into a handful of areas, giving a bit of surface overview of a lot of areas. Let's take Waterdeep for example. In the player's book, I would have one page dedicated to an overview of Waterdeep, its location, its size, some notable NPCs, some notable areas that player characters often visit, like taverns, temples, libraries, and shops. And then on the second page, I would have one or two sentences with backgrounds that hook directly into Waterdeep for each of the backgrounds that could be chosen by player characters. So, for instance, let's say that you are creating your character and you decided that your character has the entertainer background from the player's handbook, and you want your character to be from Waterdeep. There might be a single sentence in the source book that says, you worked as an entertainer at the Yawning Portal Tavern for the barkeep Durnan. This way, when the party decides to go to Waterdeep, the player character knows a little bit of specific lore about the area, and it feels like they're making a more natural decision than the previous example, both ending up with them going to the Yawning Portal to talk to Durnan, but this way it's the player choice more than the DM guiding it. This could then work in tandem with the Dungeon Master's book, where there might be a correlating entry. Again, there would be a page on Waterdeep, an expanded lore not found in the player's book, and then a chart with a single sentence for an adventure hook. Something like, if the player has the entertainer background and goes and talks to Durnan, he mentions that one of his close friends recently descended into the Intermountain but hasn't returned, and asks the party for help with finding him. Now, that would provide an idea for a quest hook that could be expanded on by the dungeon master, or even just ignored by the party if they don't bite it. But in general, it would provide a more natural sense of gameplay between the players and the dungeon masters within a pre existing campaign world. And so that's my review of Forgotten Realms, Heroes of Faerun, and Adventures in Faerun. In short, I do really like what's in these books, but my main concern is what they chose not to include in the books, and a bit of disappointment in how they could have been so much better than what we got. In my estimation, there's nothing that's bad, but I can't help but feel that they are a bit of a missed opportunity. I also wanted to give a special shout out to Mike Shea from Sly Flourish for his article, D&D Beyond Isn't a Fair Platform for Customers or Publishers, linked in the description below, where he details all of the things Wizards of the Coast has killed in the past. Let me know what you think about these source books if you picked them up, and if you agree or disagree with the things that I liked, disliked, or changed about them. What did you like or dislike about them? And if you were in charge, what would you do differently? Let me know in those comments down below. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Kevbot. Now get out there and make your name known in the realms.